Time is 6:01. I call this workshop meeting to order, and we'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Begin with an opportunity for citizens to be heard. So if there's anybody here who would like to speak on any topic for our government, come on up to the podium. Is there anybody? No? Sure. Come on up. We'll need your name and address for the minutes.
Raymond Hoy, 128 Southeast Street. I'm here not necessarily on behalf of the cyclists, but on behalf of the people who cycle around Carlisle. Just like to humanize it for just a moment. Bicycling to work is the best part of my day. This past week I saw a marten. Those are those little weasel-like things that run through town. I saw 2 doe, and I get to smell the sweet corn growing on my ride to Boiling Springs, PA. Also, sometimes it's not so sweet. I get regularly harassed more often than I get to see martens, and that sours my cycling ride. I don't necessarily have any calls to action on that behalf, but I would just like to say that I love cycling. It's an amazing part of cycling around Carlisle. That's part of the reason why I live and work here, is because I can cycle to work. That's it. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for your comment. Good applause. Anyone else? Do we have anybody by Zoom? Okay, thank you. We'll move on. The meeting minutes from last meeting. Is there a motion to approve, review and approve the May 31st workshop meeting minutes?
So moved.
Motion by the Deputy Mayor. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Councilor Mellon. I didn't want to approve these minutes. Is there any discussion? I'll call the question. All those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The motion passes. Next, we have a presentation from the United Way. Councilor Mellon's going to take the podium. Wearing a couple hats today.
Yes, so I'm down here at the podium because I'm taking off my council hat for the moment, and I'm here on behalf of my employer, which is the United Way of Carlisle and Cumberland County at 145 South Hanover Street. So I want to talk to you about Alice in Pennsylvania. So you might have heard of Alice before. The Alice movement began in 2009 at the United Way of Northern New Jersey, as they attempted to understand why, if the federal government was telling them there were only 10% of their citizens were living below the poverty level, they were having such a huge demand for their services. This grew to a statewide program, and now 15 years later, there are 23 states plus the District of Columbia who participate in the Alice movement. So the United Way here in Carlisle first introduced Alice to our community in 2019, and in April of this year we had the release of a new report statewide for Alice for the United Way of Pennsylvania, which kind of took a look at what changes the pandemic had wrought on this population. So, who is Alice? Alice is an acronym. It stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, and Employed. So these are people who are working, most of the time full-time. They're earning more than the federal poverty level, but they still aren't earning enough to basically make ends meet or meet the basic cost of living where they live. In the most recent Alice report, the median wage needed for a single adult in Pennsylvania to meet the household survival budget is $13.16 an hour. For a family of 4 with 2 adults and 2 children, it's $32.90, or an average of $16.45 an hour if both adults are working 40 hours a week. Now, what do we mean when we say survival budget? It's just basically the bare minimum cost to live in the modern economy. So there are 8 main categories: housing, childcare, food, and this is just basic groceries, no frills, no going out to eat, transportation, and by technology, we just mean a basic internet link and cell phone, no unlimited data, no high-speed broadband, no streaming service subscriptions, anything like that. So basically bare minimum. So this one might be hard to see, but if you break it down in those costs, the median rent to meet the survival budget in the state of Pennsylvania for a single adult, basically in an efficiency apartment, again, bare minimum, is $519. And for a family of 4, which is a 2-bedroom apartment, is $628. The Alice report for Pennsylvania does allow us to break it down by county, however. And so when we look at the data, we see in Cumberland County, some of the bare minimum expenses are a little bit higher here than they are than the average in the state. So you can see rent is the top line. So in Cumberland County, the minimum hourly wage needed for a single adult to meet the survival budget is actually $14.68 an hour, $1.50 more than the statewide average. And for a family of 4, it's $33.84, which works out to $16.92 per person if both adults are working. But if that parent needs childcare for their children, that puts the average wage up to $19.49 per parent, assuming both are working 40 hours a week. So there are some occupations that are harder hit than others. And so the top 5 occupations in Pennsylvania with the highest percent of workers who are living below the Alice threshold, you can see there: personal care aides, cooks, waiters and waitresses, fast food and counter workers, and nursing assistants. Now this is a template slide, we could only fit 5. If you were to combine the 3 middle ones into restaurant workers, the next you'd see on the list would be cashiers, stockers or other order fillers like at a grocery store or at some of the local warehouses, and childcare workers. So of whom at least 35% of the employees in those categories fall below the Alice threshold. These are our essential workers, and too many of them cannot get by on what they're earning. So how many people are we talking about? In the most recent report, 636 households in Pennsylvania lived below the poverty level. That's 12% of all households in the Commonwealth, but over 2 times that number is above the poverty level but falls below the Alice threshold. That ends up being 39% of households in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So basically 2 out of every 5 households in the Commonwealth cannot make enough to cover a basic survival budget. And that is an increase. It was 37% in the last report 3 years ago. That increase is despite the pandemic assistance that was provided. Over the past 3 years, the average Alice household fell short of their household survival budget by 13%, even with the expanded child tax credit and other pandemic assistance, which has now stopped. So just think if you were operating your business at a 13% loss year after year. In Cumberland County, our numbers are a bit better than the state average. So you can see on the bottom line, the number of Alice households is 26% as opposed to the state average of 27%. But at the households in poverty, it's 7% as opposed to the state average of 12%. So our average of households under the Alice threshold in Cumberland County as a whole is 33%, which is, as I said, better than the statewide average of 39%. But financial hardship is not equally distributed. Differences are stark when we look at demographic factors, particularly race. So over 60% of Black households and over 50% of Hispanic households in Cumberland County fall below the Alice threshold, compared to about 30% of white and Asian households. Additionally, age is a factor. 44% of senior households fall below the Alice threshold countywide, as opposed to 28% of people in 25 to 64 age category. And finally, household composition is a factor. It's particularly difficult for single parents. For male single parent households, 60% are below the Alice threshold. For female-led single parent households, that's 69% under the Alice threshold, compared to just 12% of 2-parent households falling under the Alice threshold. And then finally, and this is what I really wanted to get to, is that geographically, though countywide we're 6 points below the state average, there's a huge fluctuation from one municipality to the next. And you can see on this list, some of you might not be able to see as well, sorry, it's very small print. Carlisle Borough, 52% of households fall below the Alice threshold. So compare that to Dickinson Township right below. 21% of Dickinson Township is under the Alice threshold, 27% in North Middleton, or 31% in South Middleton Township. So we're sitting at 52% in the Carlisle Borough. And by the way, this is a 5-point increase from the last report when only 47% of borough households were below the Alice threshold. So that's basically 1 out of every 2 households in the Carlisle Borough is not earning enough money to cover their basic survival needs. At the same time, we are experiencing an increase in population. I shared this with you guys a while ago. The population of the borough, according to the 2010 census, was 18,682. In the 2020 census, it was 20,118. That's a 7.5% increase over a 10-year period. But a few months ago, the U.S. Census Bureau released its 2022 population estimates with an estimated population of 22,203 for Carlisle Borough. That's a 9.4% increase in our population in just 2 years. We know that Cumberland County is the fastest growing county in the state. We hear that a lot. But looking at this data, Carlisle Borough is one of the fastest growing municipalities in the state by multiple measures. The top chart shows that we rank 5th if you count by the greatest percentage increase in population over the last 2 years. And if you count by the greatest numeric increase, the lower chart shows that we rank number 2 in the entire state for the greatest numeric increase in population over the last 2 years. So going back to the local data, the most recent Alice report shows a median cost of $678 for rent for an efficiency apartment in Cumberland County. $957 a month for a 3-bedroom apartment or house. When was the last time any of you were on the housing market looking for something similar for yourselves? Does this square with the numbers that you're seeing? Because I'm not seeing these numbers. It's much higher than those numbers that you see on the page. We are experiencing a crisis in affordable housing in the borough of Carlisle. The shelters are full. There are very few rentals available at any price. The United Way receives phone calls daily from people who are desperate. They need help. They're about to be evicted. They need help staying in their homes. In some of these cases, it's because they've fallen behind in their rent because of another emergency expense, whether that's healthcare or their car breaks down. And that's the nature of the Alice threshold. One thing happens and you throw the whole budget out of proportion. But too frequently, the people who are calling us, and yes, this is anecdotal, it's simply because they were on a month-to-month lease and their landlord decided to raise their rent to take advantage of the increased demand in housing. This is an urgent need. So I just want to say thanks to council and staff for listening. I'm putting my council hat back on right now to say that I want us to keep this data in front and center as we look at everything in the future, from the strategic plan to the proposed zoning ordinance changes to our annual budget planning. Carlisle needs to be, we said in our strategic plan, we want Carlisle to be a welcoming place for everyone. And this is increasingly difficult when more and more people cannot afford to live here. So, thanks. Any questions?
Okay, thanks
Sure.
for that. Just a quick question. So, I agree with what you're saying. We as council, I think in everything we do need to look at these numbers. Is there, from the United Way, kind of an action plan of things that, I know some is federal, some is state, and some is local, ways that we can take action
Right.
that they have initially, like an advocacy plan that we can help with?
So there are a number of things statewide and nationwide. I mean, the first thing is to raise the federal poverty level so that more people are qualifying for government services. There's nothing we at council can do about that. And statewide is to advocate for an increase in minimum wage, to advocate for, more more aid for the childcare industry so that they can afford to actually pay a living wage to childcare workers, things like that. One of the few things I think we can do something about is housing by promoting more development of affordable housing. And so we have tons of data back at the office. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I just wanted to share one more story. So I guess it was last week, I was talking to the director of another agency in town, a nonprofit agency, I won't say which one. And they were having a really difficult time hiring for a part-time janitorial position. The job had been posted forever. They finally were able to hire someone. He was going to start the next week. That next week, he shows up to work on his first day and says, "I'm really sorry to do this to you, but I can only work for a month and then I'm going to have to resign." So they're trying to figure out, well, what happened between this week and last. This gentleman was retired. He was trying to live just on his Social Security, which was becoming increasingly difficult. So he thought, I need to get a part-time job, 20 hours a week. And at a nonprofit agency doing janitorial work, you can imagine the hourly wage wasn't that high. His landlord discovered that he had a job and raised his rent by $200 effective the beginning of the next month. He couldn't afford that. He could barely afford to pay what rent he had as it was. His daughter was looking for housing for him, and the only housing she could find for him that fit his budget was across the river in the city of Harrisburg. And so he had to leave town in order to be able to afford to survive. So, okay. Thank you.
I'll just say that you brought up the zoning and that this conversation has been in our conversations in different ways. So although it's not going to answer all the questions with our update tonight, I can say that we are looking continually at ways that it can further our climate action goals, our truth and reconciliation goals, our affordable housing goals. So we are definitely committed to this in work continually.
Thank you all. Thanks, Kate. Speaking of, I'm sorry, no. You feel free.
No, I was just going to make a comment. I know that I had a friend who, thought that we had some say in rent control. I know that is a problem. I wish we did. I remember, running for council and talking to Sean Cramsey, and I was like, is there a way? I mean, can we do anything about rent control here? Unfortunately, we can't. And I don't know how that starts. I don't know if it's state level, if it's the, governor who says, I have no idea how it starts, but that is an issue here too. Because like you said, and I know working in nonprofit, the reports that we get every other month whenever we're at our at the United Way meetings is that people are calling. I've had working at Hope Station. I've actually had a couple of people to call and say I'm going to lose my home. They called different places, and it wasn't that they didn't have a job. It wasn't that. It's just that, like you said, the rent went up a couple $100. They couldn't afford it anymore, and it's a sad situation. Um, I wish there was. I wish we could do something about that. So I'm just leaving a comment about it, but yeah.
You look at the one slide that had the list of municipalities, and you see, it doesn't surprise you too much the way those percentages work out. I mean, many of the boroughs have similar issues. Shippensburg was up over 70%, I think, in Shippensburg Township. But then you have the very rural townships, like Lower Mifflin was relatively high too, around where we are. So it's something that's felt throughout the county, and probably along with what our efforts will be, could use a good countywide look at it and what efforts can be brought to bear on the issue. But speaking of zoning, transition right into land use. And before I go on to that, I should mention too that I think the deputy mayor is going to be attending groundbreaking for Safe Harbor's Harbor Village next week, which is a low-income housing tax credit program. So, but those are little drops in the bucket here and there that we have. On the zoning, before I pass it on to Mr. Wilson, as you all up here know, we've had our intrepid little committee that could and will, made up of Mr. Wilson, Borough Manager Armstrong, Deputy Mayor Landis, Councilor Hicks, myself, along with the chairs of the Planning Commission and Zoning Hearing Board, Christian Muniz and Chris Fowler. I've been working on eventually bringing some recommendations to council on some land use reforms that are much needed. Council was briefed on this and given some low-hanging fruit by Mr. Wilson many months ago, I'd like to say there are a lot of brains in that room. Jared does an amazing job in there, both keeping us on point when he can and keeping us focused. But we've had some incredible discussions in that group, very, very productive, and I'll pass it on to you, Jared, to take it away.
Okay. So what started out as a density discussion has sort of morphed into a land use reform subcommittee that's looking at the established policies in the borough, the comprehensive plan, the climate action plan, the truth and reconciliation plan, urban mixed use, all these different policies that council's adopted, and our regulatory framework and borough code that pertains to land use, with particular attention on our zoning ordinance, for ways that maybe we could tweak the regulations that we have to achieve some of the things that are desired in our policies. That's the nature of land use and zoning reform, is to sort of look at what we have for regulations and consider if those regulations are helping us achieve our vision and our goals that are in those policy documents. We identified, several areas of the zoning ordinance in particular that maybe, could be revised. But it wouldn't be a proper 6-month report without talking a little bit about the planning process. The land use reform subcommittee that Mayor Schultz just talked about meets every 2 weeks. We sit and we talk for about an hour about what's in the zoning ordinance, what's in the code, what do we have to work with these adopted policy documents, and what we should sort of consider council taking up for reforms. And an hour every couple of weeks probably doesn't sound like it's too painful of an activity, but our discussions are in the weeds, in places of the zoning ordinance and borough code that probably haven't been looked at in a long time. And I think of it like cleaning out your garage, your closet, and trying to make sense of things that you've just sort of thrown in storage places and think, well, we'll get to it someday. It's kind of like that while solving a Rubik's Cube. The zoning ordinance is a voluminous document. There's a lot going on in there. One of the things that I've encouraged the committee to sort of consider is how accessible is the document? Is it easy to read? Do you need an attorney or some kind of technical person to help you do things with your property or use your property to sort of conform to what we have in code? And if the answer is yes, then are we serving everybody in the community equitably? And if the answer is no, then it's probably a place we should look for reform. There's a couple of documents that I provided to council. One you'd already seen, the incremental zoning reform in urban context. I did that one in December 5th, 2022. I apologize, it says 23 in the memo, but anyway, it was last year. And then there's front setback zoning definitions and emerging land use issues, January 20th, 2023. That second document is what I'd recommend using as basically a way of working through our land use review going forward. That is, provided council thinks we should continue with this. I think I can say that the Land Use Reform Committee thinks we ought to continue digging in, but I'll defer to the council as a whole. I did want to sort of mention some of the things that have risen to the top of the list. Within 6 months from January, we set out to look at front setbacks, consider the desirability of the public realm, the space between buildings and streets and parks and things like that, and look at all our land use regulations and consider how complex is it, and look at our definitions in our ordinance and see if there's anything duplicative or confusing. Also look at our parking standards. So there's minimum on-street or minimum off-street parking requirement for different land uses. Take a look at that. And consider the stakeholders. So what are the groups that are impacted by any recommended reforms? And also this was an important piece, having just adopted a climate action plan, is to look at climate adaptation goals for local resiliency. The climate action plan really gets at carbon mitigation and things like that. So we thought maybe this is a nice opportunity to look at ways that we can adapt to the effects of climate change, severe storms, drought, heat, degraded natural areas, and impacts to vulnerable people, and then also consider funding. So that's what we were supposed to focus on for 6 months. The report that I provided to council, and it's about 6 pages long, the bulk of it, talks about our process, and it comes up with a variety of different things that we think council maybe wants to consider short-term action on, and then 2 or 3 things that maybe would require some additional review. So I'll kind of go through that. I could get into the rest of this, but I don't want to bore you. There's a lot of stuff going on tonight. The first item is to adopt a text amendment in the zoning ordinance to reduce parking minimums for residential uses to allow a parking minimum of 1 space per single bedroom or studio dwelling unit. So right now the Borough Code requires 1.5 off-street parking spaces per 1 bedroom multifamily dwelling unit and an additional off-street parking space for each additional multifamily unit bedroom, and 2 off-street spaces for single family and townhouse uses. The reform sort of acknowledges that smaller scale housing potentially has a lower occupancy, and in turn should have a lower minimum parking requirement. So we go from 1.5 spaces, and I think the urban mixed use zoning district has like 1.2 or something like that, down to 1, as long as the dwelling unit is only a single or a single bedroom or a studio. And that hopefully would get at additional small scale housing units to talk about what Councillor Mellon was talking about tonight, and potentially encourage the reuse of existing buildings. So we have some pretty cool old brick buildings in the borough. You can see places across the country that are struggling after COVID with their office spaces. There's less desirability for an in-office situation, and repurposing some of those offices with renovations and housing can be an option if you don't have a very high on-street parking requirement. A lot of the old big buildings basically dedicated most of their land to building and not much for parking. It's only in recent time where we dedicated so much of our land to parking facilities. So that's what that one's about. And I'll just read through these, and we can pause anytime, or we can do questions at the end. The second item is to adopt a text amendment in the zoning ordinance to increase the distance to joint parking lots in commercial and mixed use zoning districts from 300 feet to 1,500 feet from the principal use measured along lines of public access. And just reading it, I can tell it's confusing and, sort of dull. But the idea is that you potentially have less on-street parking required on your lot in an urban context, a walkable place that maybe it's reasonable to presume people would walk to a remote parking lot, and on-street parking would maybe have less demand. So these are this standard currently exists. It's 300 feet for a shared parking lot between different different lots, different uses. And again, it's to increase that up to 1,500 feet, but not in low density areas. So the recommendation isn't for the R1 and the R2 or even the R3, which are mostly low density residential districts, with the exception of R3, which is more like a campus style with on street parking dedicated to those housing units. This is really for high density mixed use contexts. R4 was included in that. That's, if you look at the allowed uses, it's mostly residential stuff, but it's in direct proximity to the central business district and some other commercial stuff that's walkable, so that's included. Well, that's that recommendation. Then the next piece is adopt the text amendment in the zoning ordinance to allow one accessory dwelling unit on properties with existing lawful residential uses that do not count towards density limits, provided inappropriate physical changes to a building that are visible from a public street are disallowed. So going back to what I said before about using the adopted policies as a guide for zoning reforms. Basically, zoning 101. It's the best practice. I'll put it like this in a positive statement. The best practice is to adopt regulations that are reflected in your comprehensive plan or your master plan. If it's not in, if what you're trying to do in your regulation is not articulated in your comprehensive plan or your master plan, you probably want to wait to update your comp plan and see if the community is interested in that before you change your zoning. So with this change, staff and the subcommittee were cognizant of that reality. To add accessory dwelling units in neighborhoods that aren't used to additional density could be met with opposition. If you've reviewed any of the current practices that are published, I don't know how many people actually read planning stuff. Maybe just me and the mayors. But ADUs are sometimes met with a lot of opposition. People don't really like the changing character of their neighborhoods. But the reason ADUs can be adopted with existing comprehensive plans, in particular Carlisle Borough's comprehensive plan, is that you're sort of adding density within what would otherwise be allowed in the built environment. So if you can build a house of a certain size, or you could build an accessory garage of a certain size right now, why shouldn't you be able to add an additional housing unit? As long as it's a subordinate housing unit, you're not, you don't have the effect of increasing density. Now, density is it's a tricky regulation if you're not familiar with it. Basically, we use density to limit how many households can be allowed on a lot. So you're going to have a minimum lot size requirement for a single family unit. In more dense areas of the borough, you're going to have a higher amount of households that you can have on a lot. And in lower density areas, you're going to have a much lower, you're only going to allow one, say, or two units for a certain lot that's fairly large compared to in-town lots. Accessory dwelling units make it so that you don't have to look at, your minimum lot size. You don't have to sort of consider your maximum density requirements as long as you're playing with what's already allowed for a building size and whatnot. That additional piece about inappropriate physical changes to a building that are visible from a public street are disallowed. That gets at design and community character, rather neighborhood character. So if, as you go through your neighborhood, you're used to seeing a certain kind of built environment, you're used to seeing buildings of a certain type. This makes it so, if we go through this would make it so that you wouldn't be changing the physical character of your neighborhoods. You'd be adding additional density to the buildings that are already allowed by code, but you're not changing the character of your neighborhood. And that's important for a lot of people. Say in a single family neighborhood where people are used to seeing a house on a lot with a lot of green space and a one single door oriented to the street, they might not like to see a second door on the front of the house facing the street. They prefer to just see that one single family house. So what this potentially would do is add an entrance that's concealed from the street. So you don't change the building character, but you add a little bit of soft or gentle density to a neighborhood. That's the idea with accessory dwelling units. There's a lot of ways to tackle these. If council wants, I can bring a more thorough explanation of how the regulation would work and how we'd mitigate things that potentially could be a nuisance or a concern to people. But that's what that one's about. The next one, a little tricky. We had to get the borough solicitor to weigh in on this one. Adopted text amendment in the zoning ordinance to allow a fee in lieu for parking minimums to contribute to the borough's public parking fund in the amount of not less than $5,000 per parking space not provided. So the fee basically would be an alternative to providing on-street parking. If an applicant wanted to do a project, say they wanted to renovate one of those offices we talked about and create housing, or they wanted to do, a brand new infill project, which is, I don't want to add too much jargon to the conversation, but if you got an existing developed site and you want to redevelop it with a building, that's infill. If they want to do that and, they want to provide on-street parking, then they'd be able to do that. If they don't want to provide on-street parking, or they're limited based on the geometry of their lot and what they want to do with the building, then this would be an option where they contribute to the borough's parking fund, and we would use those funds to manage parking demand. And we manage parking demand currently with our meters, on-street parking, the parking garage, and the facilities the borough currently provides. So that would be additional funding that the council could sort of use to manage that demand. It would be an option, whereas an impact fee is typically a requirement. This would sort of be in lieu of parking. You got the option to provide this. At the end of the day, if the applicant couldn't provide on-street parking or couldn't contribute to the fee in lieu program, they'd still run into the potential of not being allowed to do the project. That recommendation doesn't get at how the borough manages the fund. It only gets at the ability to contribute to an existing fund. The next piece, and this one's tricky. This is the bulk of that 70-some page PDF that I provided to council. Adopted text amendment in the zoning ordinance to include a land use table to supplement the land use description provided in each zoning district. For anybody that's looked at the borough's zoning ordinance and kind of looked at what they're allowed to do in their neighborhood, or a different zoning district, say if you're a developer or a business person, you want to do business in Carlisle. The way it works, you go to your zoning district, informed by what's in a zoning map, and you read what the allowed uses are. And it's going to be a different list in every different zoning district. The problem with that, if I could characterize it that way, and I just did, so it's there, is that you have to sort of, hunt around in the zoning ordinance to figure out what's allowed here and what's allowed there. If you're only focused in what you can do in your neighborhood, maybe that's not such a big deal. On the policy end of things, if what we see in one neighborhood that's in a different district as another neighborhood that pretty much has the same character, uh, if uses are allowed in one district and not allowed in another, well, it's hard to find that stuff in several different parts of the zoning ordinance. It's a lot easier to see that stuff on a table. Uh, if you're a developer and you're looking at all your options in the borough, a table is a much easier way to review the ordinance. And even if you're only interested in what you can and can't do in your neighborhood, in your district, a single table that shows you what you can and can't do based on all the adopted land uses is super helpful. It's also allowed the reform subcommittee to consider that I can't remember 200 and some land uses that are adopted in the code, and how some land uses that mean the exact same thing have a different title in different zoning districts, and some have the same title but mean different things in other zoning districts based on an adopted definition. As the borough zoning officer, this gives me much anxiety. There's a pretty big chance of making a mistake. So that's my problem. Potentially yours as well if I really make a serious goof. But the biggest issue on the public side of things is that it's just confusing for people to navigate. So a table helps with our evaluation and potentially adds a simpler way of navigating the ordinance if it's adopted as a text amendment. I alluded to this next one, to delete duplicative land uses and consolidate similar land uses that have distinct titles but are the same land use activity. You'll see some land uses also have special standards. They have special standards theoretically to protect certain sensitive places in the borough, but it's not clear as you go through this if all those special standards are intended or not intended for different parts of the borough. So again, we're cleaning the garage while solving a Rubik's Cube. We don't want to mess anything up, but at the same time, it makes sense to intervene. So with the short run, we potentially adopt a text amendment as we wade through that, 50-page table document of all the different land uses and try to consider regulating by scale and intensity of land use activities rather than putting a fine point on every specific activity that might come out of a certain situation. We used manufacturing as probably the highlight of this issue. There are probably about 40 different manufacturing uses in the borough code that pertain to different little activities that may or may not happen at one little factory or one little shop downtown or whatever. And it makes it difficult to enforce because if it's adopted in one district, say the industrial district has all these several manufacturing uses with such a fine point, it begs the question, shouldn't that be allowed in other places where it's occurring? Or if it's not specifically called out in a different district, then maybe it's prohibited, maybe it's disallowed. And this gets into our process of going to zoning hearing board and asking for relief. So if the intention is just to protect one specific part of the borough and not have all this regulatory uncertainty and confusion about different parts of the borough, then we should sort of have a consistent way of looking at scale and land use intensity borough-wide. That's what this one gets at, and that's going to take a little bit of time, but I put that as a short run intervention. And then the last one is to really focus on design standards and guidelines as sort of a long run goal, where we spend a little bit less effort regulating land uses and put a little bit more emphasis on the design of the built environment, where people put their buildings, how they're arranged along a public street so that they know by right how they're contributing to what shapes the public realm. So what happens around public streets and things like that. So that's basically my report. So I'll leave it with the reforms 1, 2, 3, and 4 that I listed off in order are pretty much ready for council action whenever you want a report and a recommendation. And I'll dig way into the deep weeds with this stuff so you know all the ins and outs of at least best practice and how it affects the borough and how it ties back into our adopted policies. But the other items need a little bit more time to evaluate. So that's where we're at.
Just a couple of points on the report. Thank you, Jared, for putting that together for us. One, there will be plenty of time for public comment as those would come forward. Plenty of time for that. Two, just to put a little bit of context on a few of these. When we talk about those joint parking lots, when we looked at the borough map, the 1,500 feet is about two blocks east to west blocks. So the distance from Hanover to West Street is right around that range. Just to give you an idea of what that looks like. Two, I think that the ADUs do a number of things that I know I've heard over the years, anecdotally at least, folks who are elderly and are on fixed income. It can give them the opportunity to have some additional income from their property. It goes back to increasing rental inventory, which is sorely needed and can help over time drive down the prices and make some rentals more available. And I think those are the added benefits of the ADUs. But I want to give council the opportunity to sort of discuss, especially those first 4 points, if there's a readiness to move forward with those, get more detailed proposals on them, and then sort of generally our committee's ready to keep going. And we would plan to, as long as there's no major objection from council in doing so. Councilor Mellon, you're moving toward your mic, so go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of ADU, like in theory, I agree with you. I think it's a great way to add to housing inventory. My main concern, I think, is the tendency of people to build things like that to be short-term, like Airbnb rentals, and that we would need to make sure that we regulate that, because that's part of the problem right now is so many dwellings have been converted to short-term rentals that there's not enough long-term inventory available. My other concern is at number 4, the fee in lieu for parking. I mean, I think that's great too. I don't think we necessarily need to have, what is 1.5 parking spaces now. My concern with that is, again, looking at this in the way to try to encourage the building of affordable units. A developer that's going to plan on that and be willing to pay $5,000 per parking space might then want to get some of their investment back by building a higher end unit and charging higher rents. So I realize that by the zoning code alone, we can't encourage affordable housing development, but I would like us to keep that in mind as we make these decisions, that we're not just making decisions that are going to encourage more upscale apartments. Because yes, we have a need for those because we are in a desperate housing crisis across the board, but we also need affordable units desperately. So
yeah, I think that's and I did want to mention that too. On the fee in lieu, that would the authority for that would reside with council. So it would be discretionary with council. It wouldn't be a choice that the developer would make. And really, if a developer is going to build higher end apartments, that fee in lieu, they either won't seek that fee in lieu, they don't need it. They'll just have the added parking. So based on those two factors, I think we'd be pretty well protected from that occurring. Mr. Stubbe.
Yeah, I just kind of somewhat piggybacking on that, specifically to the parking, I guess 1 and 4. I just was curious if any of you all could provide a little additional information on how that number was determined, like decreasing from 1.5 to 1, and potentially having this fee, and if we need parking minimums. I mean, could we just not have that entirely and essentially just eliminate number 4 and just have no parking minimums? And I guess piggybacking your point, then if you're not required to have parking or pay a fee, ideally that's one less expense for somebody who is trying to make residential units that are affordable. Just kind of curious as to what to get a little more detail on how that number was settled upon and the discussion around that.
Yeah, I'll let Jared take some of that, but we actually talked about having parking maximums at one point. But Jared, if you want to address those, you were deep in those questions.
Okay. So parking maximums, we'll still probably get into that. Councilor Hicks has said this a bunch of times. We need to look at that. There's plenty of parking for some of the underutilized commercial lots in the borough. I don't need to call anybody out. We know where they are. There's some strategies that we're going to consider probably going forward, but this really just gets at your parking minimums. I can reflect on the last community I worked for and some others that I looked at where they said basically one spot is acceptable for a studio or a single bedroom without too much pushback. Your others, the prospect of deleting all parking minimums is it's very interesting. There is a sort of reform that's going across the country where places are just deleting parking minimums completely. They're leaving it to lenders to sort of determine what they're willing to provide for in terms of loans, funds and whatnot, on what they think the market really wants for a parking requirement. Or, otherwise they won't provide the loan. That's one piece. The other piece is the developers probably have a better sense of what the market wants, better than the planner. So those are kind of 2 points for getting rid of all your parking minimums. And I don't want to say a lot in terms of positive for maintaining parking minimums, because I have my own opinions, professional about those. But suffice it to say that there is still a parking demand for land use activity. So it begs the question: if they're not going to park on site, where are they going to park? And this for your public consideration, in terms of managing on-street parking and whatnot, having a developer provide on-street parking potentially reduces the demand for public parking. So it probably makes rational sense to have some parking minimum. That and the potential for serious pushback in neighborhoods where they're used to having a developer provide on-site parking to sort of reduce the demand for on-street parking that they're used to having in their neighborhoods. So you have to kind of thread that needle. So that's basically, I'll sum it up that way. I won't get too far in the weeds, but that's basically how that works.
And that's especially true in some of the older parts of the borough too. And we encountered some issues with parking when the Methodist Church was geared up to be redeveloped. So that would have to be very obvious. Everything needs to be a very thoughtful process, but that could have some effects on folks who already have properties within the borough and their parking availability. And I think if you look at the need for some minimum in conjunction with that joint parking expansion, it helps at least reduce the number of on-lot, impervious coverage and parking spaces on each individual lot, and allows people to cooperate and maybe have more efficiency in what they do.
I think that there was one other question about the fee in lieu methodology, how we came up with that number. The Cliff's Notes version is that it was copied and pasted from the city of Portland, Maine, and I was pretty transparent about that in my memo. But I felt after reviewing their fee methodology, that it was appropriate to make that recommendation for Carlisle Borough. Obviously, Carlisle's not the city of Portland. It's totally different size, totally different context. But what they used is, I read through what they had as a parking plan from many years ago. They had a parking plan where they sort of established what the going rate was for a parking spot. So what Councilor Mellon was talking about, costs sort of shifting onto, the cost of rent and onto the renter. What they did is they looked at what would already be potentially a cost that a developer would be anticipating for providing parking. And then they considered an indexed fee calculation based on, what is this thing? I looked it up just to be sure it was a real thing, and I talked to an actual engineer about this. The Engineering News Record Construction Index. And I tried to do the math as best a planner can do based on the methodology that they used. And so the going rate back in 2008, when they had their Peninsula Transit Study Report and Action Plan, was $5,000 per spot. And then using the fee methodology with the indexed rates that are provided by the Engineering News Record, without a subscription, I couldn't find the 2023 rates, but I could find the 2020 rates. I came up with a per parking space cost of $6,577.36. There are other fee in lieu of parking standards in Jenkintown and New Hope that we could look at. It's been done in Pennsylvania, but I like the way that they put it together in Portland, so that's where the recommendation came from.
Mr. Crampson.
Yep. So Jeff stole my thunder because I was going in the same space if we need minimum parking, but you guys, I think, fixed that for me. I guess going to number 4, I was kind of looking at this differently. I think when we get our budget projections, the parking fund, correct me if I'm wrong, is pretty stable. And instead of doing that, and again, I don't know if this is legal, and I'm not sure what we have on the books already, but if we could do a sliding scale for development to a Parks and Rec or Public Works fund, because I think as developers build or folks build, I'd rather have them see where their fees are going. I don't know if they're going to see it in the parking fund. So if it's going to a parks fund and we can do protected bike lanes or, street light upgrades or something like that, I'd be open to a conversation. That might be a different conversation than this one. But looking at our schedule and seeing what's legal when it comes to, based on the size of your development, if someone's developing a huge housing development and it's, $50,000, if that can go into a public goods fund, I think for me, I'd be more supportive of that type of fee than the in lieu of for parking, because I just don't know if that's an urgent need for us. And also, we're not losing on-street parking. Like, our parking stock is what it is, so I don't see that hurting that revenue stream.
And you may have comments, you too. Sure. Probably not too many questions.
Well, I'd have,
Maybe.
yeah, no, I don't have too many questions there, but context as well is what, so, when Kate, gave us that report, earlier in the meeting, and we talked about affordability, although this seems like to many people, not people in our committee, because we are passionate about this, but it sounds boring. But this is how we as council can address the affordability. So it's in how much parking costs. It's in where can you increase density. It also adds to integrated schools, authentic integration of schools, when you can have different price points, because right now there are neighborhoods that are priced out, and historically, preventing our Black neighbors from gaining generational wealth. Like, these are the reasons why there are different areas within our community. So I do understand stakeholders. I know that we're going to have those conversations, but we need just as many yes in my backyards, to come to our meetings and support these thoughtful changes, because these are not on a whim. We have sat for many hours in these meetings, and we talk about how we care about climate action. This is also a climate action. These are choices that are thoughtfully made. The one thing I will The other thing is also, we talked about the zoning hearing board, and right now, all of these questions that we have and all these things that people maybe want to change, they have to go to the zoning hearing board. And when Jared was talking about, do you need a lawyer? People hire a lawyer to come to that meeting to say, I just want my driveway to be 5 feet over. I've seen, one of those cases, and it seems unreasonable that we are putting our residents through that. So we're looking at this so it makes more sense. It's easier for people that own their properties to make some small changes that make sense. And it's not getting rid of the zoning hearing board, but also just aligning things that we continually approve in the zoning hearing board. Yes, yes, yes. Well, if something we're always yesing, then it should be in our core documents. So that's a lot of what this has been when we're discussing the Airbnb question. A neighbor brought that one up as well. We have talked about it, but I do think coming back around on that is actually really timely. I read an article that Airbnbs are crashing right now, and there is we're not maybe in the crash market, Phoenix is, but they are selling, and so that that could be helpful to us. But also just rental. We have a rental inspection ordinance, and pulling those back in and making sure that they aren't flying under the radar, and that what we're trying to do with the ADUs do not just become short-term rental market. The only thing that was left that we had by the time we had our last meeting is still I still am questioning is the number one is reducing parking minimums for one space for a single bedroom, but in our code it does say an additional parking space per bedroom, and I do not think personally that is needed, and I think that that's going to exacerbate the affordability and the sprawl. So I don't know that because I don't think when we were initially discussing, we weren't everyone wasn't aware that it was per bedroom. But I do remember when we had the Grace Church discussion, it's right next to it's the R4 right next to the C1, and in the C1 it is one bedroom, just one parking space, period, like not per bedroom. And so we changed it, and and it seemed reasonable. So I think that having a minimum of one space, period, is still providing, but also using our public sphere and shared parking as an option. So that's the only thing I would say about that one. But otherwise, it's been a great 6 months, and I love that meeting. And we have it again on Wednesday, and I look forward to it every time, no matter how dry people think it is.
Yeah, I don't like the 8 o'clock start times, but I understand those are the constraints of the system. I appreciate Jared's leadership on this, and I'll say this is a start. This is the start of, I think, a needed process. I had a very disappointed look on my face when it was I was convinced that we needed to work within the zoning districts we had in place, that was going to be a more constructive approach. After some nudging, I think that is the right approach. I think we can make more progress faster working with it. If we started from a clean slate, I think we would do things a little bit different than what you're saying. But we're not, and I think we're being agile and responsive and staying within the way we've coded the district. I am, correct me if I'm wrong, Jared had gone to a conference to try to get some input about how other boroughs and townships were handling this sort of revision, and I'm paraphrasing, but he got a lot of blank looks. He goes, nobody is doing what we're doing. We don't have anything to educate you on. Good luck. And so we're kind of doing things as best we can. There aren't a lot of municipalities our size that are taking the scale of an overhaul we're doing. And so, we always appreciate, someone checking our work, making sure that we're not overstepping or missing something. We're looking at best practices in areas we're doing, but there are very, very few examples of municipalities that have taken this on that we can just kind of reach back and hey, look, what have they done, across the county line? They're not doing it. So that's been an added sort of challenge. It's been a good challenge, but it's been kind of novel in that sense. Um, what is striking to me is that there's trade-offs. All public policies trade-offs, and answer Councilor Stubbe's address one of the things. We have a very paved borough that's not optimally utilized. We have we have some underutilized space in public lots that I think allow us to quickly employ like four. We have the capacity to use spaces that aren't being used. Now, I would love to see a lot of that space turned to green space or to be repurposed for other things. That would be a little bit more consistent with our climate action goals. But, if that means we can add, 6 more households on a block, that's the trade-offs we make in terms of the best use of our land. And I think we have the right mix of boards and committees at this to try to strike that balance. So that's what we'll continue to do. I look forward to continuing to work on this. There's just more. We've talked about a lot more than what we're seeing here. I think we captured the things that are most ready to go, and look forward to working with you to get some of this passed. Thanks.
Anything? No. Okay. I guess just to sort of circle back to the question at hand, and maybe I'll pose it this way: is there any objection to having staff go forward and draft some specific proposals on 1 through 4? Okay. And is there any objection to the committee continuing its work? Okay. All right. We will. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
I had one more question, Jared. You might be happy to know that I did actually read your 58-page document. Not the whole thing. I looked at the line items that I found the most pertinent, of course, the ones dealing with residential land use. I'm a firm proponent of building up. And of course, I think right now the only zone we can do that in is the urban multi-use. Is that right? For residential. But I noticed on your attachment that mid-rise apartments and mid-rise stacked apartments are highlighted in yellow, and there's no key that says what that means. Why are those highlighted? I don't know if you want to answer that, or somebody else in the committee can answer that. So
it's no big secret. That was sort of a working document, and the yellow was to sort of identify similar titles. So that piece that we said, well, if it's effectively the same thing, then maybe we should consolidate it into one land use. So all the yellow is like, let's look at this for consolidation.
hoping that was something to eliminate. We can just go ahead and build up. But
no,
We've
well,
talked
I think
about building up too.
we did, and I know I've said that for years. I think Brenda said it for years, and certainly there's a lot of interest in that. Just on that point, though, since you highlighted the highlighted uses, that is, and we don't get as many text amendment requests as we used to, but I think both of those uses were subjects of text amendments during my time on council. That a developer, we wanted to provide that use in a zone, it wasn't there, and developer comes forward with a proposed ordinance that council then votes on. So, and there are a number of uses like that in the ordinance that you just get this hot pot. Going back to the garage analogy, it's like you buy something. You toss it when you use it. You toss it in the box somewhere in the garage and forget that you had it almost, or you need something close to that. Instead of going back and digging through, you just add another item. So hopefully we do a good job cleaning that up by the time we're all done here. But we'll move forward with those first 4 recommendations, and the committee will continue to do its work. Thanks again, Jared. Outside agencies. Budget finance, outside agencies, and neighborhood grants. Who's going to lead this discussion? Jeff, you got it.
Yeah, I can take this, and then Owen and Joel, you can kind of chime in if there's anything I'm missing. But obviously, as you all know, every year as part of the budget, the borough sets aside $10,000 to award grants or funding to outside agencies, a variety of different organizations throughout the borough that do a variety of different things. A number of years ago, the process for that was revamped so that we have specific guidelines that they need to meet. There's an application process. As you all know, they come and present, those organizations come and present to council, and then a subcommittee essentially of council. This past year, it was Councilor Hicks and myself, reviews those applications and then makes recommendation to council for how that funding should be broken down and included in the budget. As you might recall, last year we had requests for nearly 3 times the amount that we had allocated. So we allocated 10,000. We had requests totaling nearly 30,000 from 15 different organizations. And in my brief experience with this process over the past few years, there seems to be a history of the borough through this process awarding funding to any organization that applies for it. And I think Councilor Hicks and myself had this concern that if we continue with that and we continue to have more applicants as we have, it seems that every year we have more applicants for greater amounts of money. We're kind of watering down this pool of funding that we have. So we talked about a couple of different things, and if you got to see the memo that Owen put together, essentially looking at how we might revamp the process for this year and then moving forward. I think the guidelines themselves are helpful, but more specifically on either the amount of money we allocate or saying that we're only setting aside X number of specific grants, or maybe it's just a blanket, including when we're advertising this, that you're making it clear that not all agencies are guaranteed funding just because they apply. And I think we wanted to kind of open things up to the rest of the council to see what your thoughts are on this, that we could discuss it and kind of come to a decision before we kick the outside agency process off. So there's obviously the option of increasing the amount that we allocate, instead of 10,000 having more, or in some way tying that to inflation, or the other option as well is having set number of grants. A couple options here: providing 10 grants of $1,000 each, or providing 10 grants of varying amounts, such as 2 grants for 2,000, 4 for 1,000, 4 for 500. Obviously, that can fluctuate, but I guess kind of just open it up. I don't know if Joel or Owen, you have anything you want to add before we kind of open it up to discussion, see what others' thoughts on that are and how you think we should proceed. Oh, and I guess, sorry, one other thing to tie in there. In the past, the borough had awarded funding to different neighborhood groups. At one point, there were more organized neighborhood groups than there are now. That was $250, a flat fee of $250, or flat amount of $250 to the neighborhood groups when they applied for it, essentially. And then over time, that amount varied. And with the outside agency funding process being revamped, that kind of fell to the wayside. So another thing to factor in there is whether we should restart those neighborhood grants to those organizations, or if we should in some way just fold that into the outside agency funding process and make them aware of that, should they be interested, because that's something that I think there's been confusion for those groups. I mean, at this point particularly, I think the Eastside Neighbors Association is the only one that's regularly meeting, and I know they've expressed confusion as to if that's still an option and how they'd go about it. So I think those are the things we wanted to kind of discuss and hopefully kind of make a decision on as to how we want to approach it.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. That was pretty complete and accurate. I think the other consideration for our criteria in terms of how potentially we would navigate a fewer set of applicants is the likelihood that who we're supporting could, either through like their own resources or their criteria for getting other grant money, would maybe be subservient to agencies who come to us who don't really have readily another source for grant funding, and the idea of being able to really kickstart something with a little bit more substantial funding, maybe if it's a little bit more modest of an organization, again, that doesn't have the resources or capacity or criteria to get funding from other things, might raise its level in terms of being considered for one of these. I'll just say last, I would probably lean toward, maybe a higher level for 4 or 5 agencies. And I think we should also make sure that anyone who does apply kind of checks all the boxes. I think we had some situations where it wasn't crystal clear what the funding was going to be used for. I think we should probably make sure that's a little bit more transparent. But yeah, so I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts about this.
Any comments?
Yeah, this is great work. I'm glad we're bringing this up. I just had 2 suggestions. One, I think piggybacking on what Joel said, if there's a way within the application we can outline that these are public funds that have to be used for public initiatives. And I'm not trying to pick on any group, but I think maybe what Joel was bringing up is there was some confusion in one of the previous years with a religious affiliated group, and I obviously don't think our taxpayer dollars should be going to support those efforts, no matter how great they are. I did get a question from a resident on that when we did that approval. And then I think my second suggestion would be if we can add to the application maybe a checkbox that whoever gets the funding is going to agree to follow our human relations ordinance and won't discriminate on how they use it. Because I do feel we get in this situation where we kind of cut the check and then we don't control where the money goes. And I think in the previous year, that's where that resident's concern came up of it goes into a pot for a group and might not be going to the best spot where public funds should be used.
I think that I agree with Joe also. I think that, some of so I've only been here for one. But I noticed that there were organizations who were asking for funding for like a particular project or something that they're working on. And I think that, if especially if they're not asking for a lot, then maybe we say, okay, so this organization is doing this particular thing and is asking for funding for this. Maybe they get a little bit more. And maybe some of the others get a little bit less, depending on what it is that they're doing. But I think that, yes, we should definitely know where the money is going and what they're using it for. And if there's a way that we can increase the funding, I think that would be really good too, because I mean, $1,000 is good to have, especially if you're a small nonprofit. But a little bit more than 1,000 would be great too.
So I had a question about, I think it was Latort Regional Authority. As of this current year's budget, I guess the funding was given its own line item, and they were not part of this outside agency process. And I wonder if we can just review the criteria which allowed for that to happen, and is there a process by which another organization might meet that same criteria? I suppose what I'm suggesting is historically, now we have records of this from the 1980s. The Carlisle Borough funded every year with a line item in the budget, Bosser Memorial Library. I think the last document we found in the archives was 1986 at the library, which was $14,000 in the budget that year to the library. And it wasn't part of a process where they had to come apply every year. Adjusted for inflation, I think that'd be something like $70-some thousand, which is obviously never going to happen. But I guess my point is, I feel that they're like organizations like the library, which really do serve the entire community, seem to me to fall in a different category than maybe some of these other outside agencies. So if council would be willing to move the library over and not require them to apply every year in competition with other agencies. I mean, we actually are relying on the library for some things, asking them to hold events, and it is something that serves the entire community in a lot of ways, including internet access for those that don't have it, and that sort of thing. So I don't know at what point in the funding process we would make a decision like that, but I'd just like to put that out there as a possibility.
I think the borough manager will correct me if I'm wrong about the Latour Regional Authority. But we have appointments to that board, so I think that was part of the criteria. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the recommendation. Very similar now. There used to be a downtown Carlisle Association that we had to be there pitching for outside agencies. They weren't vying for the $10,000. It was, that they had made a pitch during that particular meeting, and we elected that they no longer needed to go through this outside agencies process.
Right, we have a contract with them. We have representation on their board also. Yeah.
Right. So I guess just to clarify, if my understanding was correct, we're, for lack of a better term, almost like contractually obligated to provide support to the Latour Regional Authority. A number of municipalities do. Just that was kind of tied into the outside agency funding process, but it was almost pulling away from that $10,000 pot because we knew we had to give to them already. So it was almost like, well, we already are going to have to give $2,500 to the Latour Regional Authority, so that leaves $7,500 for everybody else. So as opposed to doing that, we're like, that should just be its own line item because we are more or less contractually obliged to provide them funding because of our participation in as well as that of other municipalities. So that way it frees up the $10,000 for the other organizations that apply. That was my understanding, if I'm saying.
Yeah, there wasn't a specific amount specified. It was implicit that we will provide some financial support. So pulling that out made sense moving forward.
And then that was kind of like
right.
allowing our funding to be in line. Sorry, that was allowing our funding to be in line with the other municipalities participating or part of the Latour Regional Authority. So.
1 second.
We'll
have comment.
We'll get to.
No. Your indulgence, I have to go to urgent care.
Okay.
Okay. Sure.
And I've enjoyed this experiment in local government, and I think it's been a pleasure and an honor. Your carrier waves mess up my ears, but I'm here to support the Ammonia Festival to help you guys do that. I realize you have an agenda, and I thought this thing would be easier, but my daughter's going to come and pick me up. Please make the Ammonia Festival work for Saturday. I realize these are really important things that you guys have to do. I just want to remind you that the Ammonia Festival has existed before the Bluegrass on the Grass as a festival, and it's an important part of the Carlisle community. And I realize this is not an ideal time to have it. I think we're going to try and hold on to the first weekend in May in Kansas. We'll talk about that. But I think it's really important that we maintain the integrity of the fair, the institution, and the concept of diversity, because I think diversity in America is getting a bad rap. And I think one of the special things about Carlisle is that you have mechanisms in place to give everybody something to do and connect with everybody. It's unfortunate that things went south for these guys. I think they're going to work on it. We're working on solutions in-house, and I'll let Mr. Roy and my good friend, but I'm going to go.
Thanks. Could we get your
We just need
your name and address?
My name is Greg Stravanko, 531 Franklin Street.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, and
No.
I hope the land use reform didn't drive you to urgent care.
I'm also a member of the Patron Bluegrass on the Grass, which I hold in the highest regard. Some of my favorite times were with this gentleman here. So I think we can make this thing work. Please help that fashion. I support both of these things. We're better together, and rather than either or, we're better and both somehow. Okay, we don't want to do it at the same time. This is not desirable. But let's get it done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I apologize.
I just had a couple comments left on the outside agencies. I agree with Kate in some ways. Like I've had discussions about Bosler, but whenever the outside agencies have come up, one of the questions specifically with Bosler, also with like summer fair, but how many people are they serving? And Basler has always been able to give that number. And how many Carlisle folks are they serving? And also low income people of low and moderate income. So I think it's also why I mean, you know. Sean had talked about some of the other questions of other people that have brought things forward. I mean, I've questioned the dog park simply because the dog park is not free, right? So I'm not saying it's not a great opportunity, but I think that that's always been something. Are they serving? Who are they serving? How many people? Low and moderate income, and are they free services that are benefiting? Across the board. I've also benefited from the neighborhood grants. It actually made me think that there could be something that could be used that could just get replenished. But I think that one thing with that is that as neighborhoods organically change, it's hard to figure out who to connect with. So I think that our outreach has to be better on that, because I think that you could also get people that could come together and be like, oh, my neighborhood could use this, and they could reinvigorate some of these neighborhood groups that maybe have gone dormant when people can't lead them anymore. But yes, I'm all for this change. I'm not committed to any particular way that it's funded, but I think 10 grants of varying numbers, but also really getting at the heart of who are these grants serving, and ensuring that we're trying to make the most bang for our buck across the board to our residents. So.
Any other questions, comments? Okay.
I agree with all those criteria. I guess I would ask council, would it be helpful as we edit this again? Do we want to establish criteria that we would notionally use, each evaluating along certain lines, or we can keep it subjective too? I want to respond to your comment by, we could go one or two. We could actually decide, let's build some criteria, bring it back to council. Maybe that's too,
Well,
that's too much.
I was going to make some comments. So I was trying to defer to everybody else, but I do think we need to have some criteria, and I think that's how the outside agency process has been moving over the years. Every time we've done some reform, it used to be there was nothing. I mean, we just get these applications. There was no organization expected to that application. They didn't need to touch on anything really, just to ask for the money. So I think there was, I don't know, was that maybe 10 years ago now, at least, that it was last reformed, and some of that was added. As we go forward, and I think there's going to be some support to have some criteria. As we do that, I think something that the deputy mayor mentioned was not only how many are being served, but who's being served, because there are organizations and people in this borough who have been subject of historic inequities, and so it might not be serving 10,000 people, but it's serving a population that has felt historic inequities. And to that point, I know personally that there was a point when the organizers of the Memorial Day event at Memorial Park were considering a need for funding this year. It was well after our outside agency process. That obviously, you could probably say that serves a neighborhood and pickup population, but the number of people who attend that, depending on how you judge that number, but there's a need. I mean, that's a central part of some historic inequities in that neighborhood and at the park. So the criteria there's going to be some subjectivity to that, I think is somewhat necessary. Try to make it as objective as possible, understanding that there's going to need to be weighing of things that perhaps you can't put numbers to. Right? To Council Crampsey's point on the religious organizations, I don't remember if we actually funded that organization, and that did come across as sort of more of a church promotional event. There are also churches in this borough that do good work that are not necessarily promotional of the churches, so I wouldn't want to exclude churches from applying for funding, and other religious organizations from applying for funding. but it would need to be something that's akin to what a nonprofit would otherwise do. And as we think about that criteria, I think we ought to think about that sometimes a $500 grant for a smaller organization can mean a lot more than a $2,500 grant for a larger organization. Yeah.
Just to add to your one point, that has me thinking, and I don't know if it's worth doubling the pot of money, but I'm wondering if it's not too much of a burden if this should be twice a year, because you mentioned a group that, you know, if you miss the deadline and then you're going a year as potentially as a nonprofit without another chance, would it make sense to either double the funding or cut it in half and do it twice, so folks you know, might not have to come in September or October, but summer fair or whoever's doing something in spring or summer has a closer chance and maybe a better idea of what they're using it for. Or folks that are coming in September don't need it till the next August, and they might not have some of that criteria if that gives them a closer window if you do it twice in a 12-month period.
It's a good idea to consider. Thanks.
Just to, are we, since this is kind of tied to the budget right now, are we able to do that? I mean, like right now, my understanding is we kind of say like there's $10,000 set aside, and then when we actually approve the budget, that is broken down in there, as opposed to just saying we have $10,000, we're going to decide how we allocate it later on. Does that kind of present any concern to say it that way?
Not at all. I mean, you'd be able to budget. Let's say if at some point with inflation doubles and it's 20,000, you could say you budget the 20,000, and then you provide those two opportunities, and then that gets allotted to those two opportunities during the year. There are a number of things in our budget that we don't necessarily know what's going to come in, how much is going to come in, what kind of needs are going to come in, and we budget that way every year.
I guess maybe that would be beneficial too, in one sense that there would maybe be a little more transparency in our approval of it. Not to say that there isn't right now, but it's kind of like we hear the applications, we make a decision, we make a recommendation to council, and it's just kind of like one thing on our agenda item amongst all the other budget stuff. Whereas if it's like at set times, it's maybe its own thing to be approved, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes it a little more transparent, or at least a little more focus on it, I guess, maybe is a better way to put it. In terms of like additional criteria, would it be helpful if we had, as opposed to kind of the guidelines we have now, if we have like a specific application that it needs to be completed? Because right now we kind of get a pretty diverse array of the way when people apply, their applications look very different. If we just kind of have like a standard form that, you know, needs to be completed, or like set number of questions that need to be specifically answered to be able to be considered for funding, would that be helpful?
I think that would be helpful. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Be easier to consider them, I'm sure too. Yeah, absolutely. Have a form together.
And just to maybe look to Owen and Susan, when do we need to have this finalized for this year if we, you know, want to make changes? Would we say we need to like have this finalized next month, or by September?
Okay, typically we would put the invitations out in the August time frame, and the applications were due typically by the end of September each year. One thought that I had was that your team could review the application guidelines as they're written now, including the primary funding areas, as well as there were actually 3 questions that we tried to request that applicants respond to. Maybe take a look at that, and we can be prepared to come back to Borough Council for your August workshop with proposed with a form as you suggested, and any potential changes to the guidelines as written. If you and Councilor Hicks and Assistant Manager Snyder are able to do that this month.
Not as deep a dive as the zoning subgroup, but I feel like we could tackle it.
And something you said that reminded me that the one bullet point we have here is to stop sending letters to specific organizations. Was there a reason for that? And should we talk about, not tonight necessarily, but how we do outreach? Again, going back to, I mean, there are organizations who are going to be much more aware of this, and there are going to be people in the borough who just don't have, we don't reach as well as we should. And I know we're talking about putting it up on social media and website and that sort of thing, but there are neighborhood organizations that used to be much more active are no longer as active, so that we have fewer places to get the word out on these things. So I think, well, one, I posed the question: what was the rationale for
That was the
discontinuing?
original updated when Deb and I had looked at it, and it was because I think that's actually how we got the church to apply, because it only went it wasn't really a public outreach. It was going to the specific organizations, and that's why we would get the same ones. And we talked. I think we talked about it more as because Deb, was the Elm Street manager, and I did stuff with neighborhoods to try to get more of that, grassroots outreach. So it's not that we couldn't send it additionally to the organizations that have applied in the past, but it's also having more of a public outreach. So because before it seemed like it was more of a hand-picked list, or we were afraid that it looked like a hand-picked list, and we were trying to get away from that and trying to make sure that it was an open call.
Okay, good.
With criteria.
Yeah. That addresses it.
Now, Owen, correct me though, on staff's end, we continued to give a courtesy heads up to those that had been funded previously, correct? While we didn't send a formal letter out, we still continued
Correct.
that process.
Yeah, but I think, as was already stated, but just to emphasize, in the past, it only went to a certain number. So now I think we're doing a little bit of both. That we're promoting it on social media and our website, and then we're also providing people who have expressed interest in the past. So, we can look at other ways to reach out.
Okay. Anything further?
So just to clarify, I think our game plan is we're going to kind of try to refine this further so that at the August workshop we come back with here's our plan. Does this sound good? And then go from there. Is that what we're saying to do? Does that sound good? Okay.
I'm seeing head nods, so we're going to go with the head nods.
That's all I have.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Stubbe. Public safety, Amani is up. Not sure how we want to handle this. Tanis, do you want to step up and kind of give us an update where things stand before we move into the further discussion? Yeah, to the podium. Yeah, thank you. And we know who you are, but name and address. You can use a business address, whatever you prefer to use.
Tanis Monroy, 50 West Ridge Street in Carlisle. So an update on Amani. I've been talking with Owen Schneider and Sergeant Bucher for the past few weeks now to try to come up with some alternative plans to our original request. And the latest is that we're thinking, instead of asking for 2 blocks of West High Street and also 2 blocks of Pitt, north and south, just to take the north side from the corner of Hamilton there to the end of Pitt Street where it crosses to Lowther, or by First United Church of Christ. And for that, so that the event can be a little bit further away from town and give plenty of room for parking, instead of closing up the entire downtown. And as well as First United being a partner, they've also offered for us to use their parking lot in their grass lot that they have up above. So it gives us more flexibility to put our craft vendors, our small tables, and they said since they're not open on the weekend, then closing that alley wouldn't be an issue. So that's where we are right now. we're just trying to be as flexible as we can, especially with the late notice and just trying to get up and running again.
Are there any councils or questions from council on this?
I do. How many vendors are coming this year? I know because I've been I follow the page, and I saw a lot of comments from a lot of vendors not happy that they weren't getting responses. Um, so, how are you deciding on vendors and how many?
We have approximately 40. We would have had more back in May. And then we're anticipating that a few might drop off because that normally happens on the event anyways. But to your comment on social media, we are trying to get a specific communication team to be able to get back at not just vendors, but also our partners in a more timely manner. So this week we've been making a few more rounds of just contacting people if we have their phone or their email. And a lot of times we have older information, so we're hoping to use our social media more effective moving forward.
Any other questions? Terrence, I'll give you an opportunity. I know organizing events like this can be a struggle, and sometimes finding volunteers and getting volunteers focused can be a challenge in and of itself. I was chair of Summer Fair years and years ago, and so I can appreciate the difficulty there. Is there we have Sentinels here. Maddie's here with us tonight. Is there a need for volunteers moving forward? I'm going to assume the answer is yes.
Yeah, definitely. So last year I had stepped down because I had a child on the way. But we've always struggled with volunteers, and almost any nonprofit can tell you that. But we're working on getting a better core, but we can certainly use more help, so we can have more hands on deck. So if somebody has a life change or gets an illness, then we have more help. So yeah, if you want to put in the send though that we can use more help, they can reach out on our Facebook.
Yeah, we'll go through comment. Yeah, sure. Anything else for Tanis then? All right, thank you for the update.
Thank you guys.
Hey, Mayor, can I Tanis, can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
Tanis.
Oh, it's Owen's over here. You'll have to go back to the podium, Tanis. Sorry, I wasn't in. Owen's always so quiet over there. This is shocking.
I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page. We talked about was closing North Pit from High to Lowther. You mentioned an alley, and I just want to make sure, is it just the street, or has something changed from the last time we spoke?
Yeah, just the street. Just the church would be okay if we had to close down what's a Dickinson Alley, if we had to. But as far as the Amani stance, we don't need it. We'd rather have that as good traffic for vendors and people going in and out.
Thank you. Just wanted to make sure.
Sure.
I can't remember. I used to live on that section of Lowther, and I can't remember the alley. Is the alley one way headed west? Is that right?
It's going west
toward Dickinson College.
Yes,
right? Yeah.
Correct.
Sorry. So we'd have to perhaps permit opposing traffic to violate the one way for day to get, because there are businesses along there that would need access to their parking.
Correct. But yeah, when we worked through this earlier, my understanding was we'd just be closing the street. So
right. Yeah. So the street's closed, the alley's open, but then we have to get traffic flowing the other way.
You're correct. Staff Sergeant Bucher, I believe, and Owen have worked on those logistics. It was envisioned that because Dickinson Avenue is used heavily by the restaurants that front High Street, patrons, will they frequent those parking lots. So we want to make those accessible still for our small businesses, and so bringing that traffic in from the other end.
And this is not really any different than normal, because they always have North Pit closed off. So it's not like this
Correct.
particular approval is anything different than your standard Amani, at least on that block, right?
Right. Yeah. Usually it's like a big cross. So instead of having the other 3 points, we're just keeping the one point.
So the 40 vendors, you said the church would allow you to use the grassy area on top. Do you envision vendors set up in the church parking lot, or is that kind of where the vendors will be parking their trucks and trailers to get them out of the way?
A little bit of both, depending on overflow. We measured out yesterday how many vendors we can fit from the corner there of Hamilton all the way to Lowther, and it's just down the middle, um, between 25 to 30, and then using like the curbs and sidewalks for the rest. But it gives us flexibility to use the parking lot and the grass lot.
Anything else?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much of a conflict this is going to detract from either one of these, but it may a little bit. But I mean, moving forward, is it fair to say you're going to try to deconflict these in future years and kind of get ahead of it? You know, I know
Yeah,
these things. Okay.
yeah, definitely. We've even been talking about moving Amani from first week of May to maybe June, maybe August, because it's always rainy, and then that causes us to have to reschedule. Oh, it rains in the afternoon, and then it ends up being a literal wash. But we'll definitely be more careful when it comes to July with Summer Fair and also some of the Carlisle events.
Feel free to say no comment to this, but do you plan on sticking around now that you're pulled back in? You're like Michael Corleone, right? Every time you try to get out, they pull you back in.
Yeah, I mean, I can sit down if you want, or I could just stay here.
So, not to put you on the spot. But, okay. Any other questions, comments? Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
All right. Any other? We had a hand down here, and then we can get you to Wanda in the back. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
I'm Scott Buren, 111 South College Street, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I'm the co-founder and project coordinator for the J. Sherwood McGinnis Junior War, Peace, and Justice Project. I have a vested interest in the Amani Festival because of the nature of the War, Peace, and Justice Project. I think it's important. We don't sell a product or a craft. We try to educate and provide a service to the community and educating those on war, peace, and justice. The Amani Festival, to me, and I think my predecessor and the late Sherwood McGinnis would offer that they're very much related. And I think based on Mr. Steranko, what he said epitomizes why this is an important event for everybody. It's about educating those on racial diversity and peace and justice, which seems to me in great tribulation at this point in our history as a nation. So I would like tonight to commit my staff, albeit very small, and our organization to somehow partner with the Amani Festival for future years, because we have a vested interest. And Thomas, I appreciate all you do for the community, and we're here to support that as a potential partner. If we could do that, that would be wonderful. And I think if we look at the Amani and bluegrass on the grass and do a cost-benefit analysis, I'm not sure there's a huge loss. That's just my personal opinion, having been a resident here and attended both functions for several years now. Granted, I think Mr. Steranko said it best. Ideally, they'd better off separated by time and space. But we all know that the number of events here in Carlisle are sometimes overwhelming. To try to deconflict things is quite a challenge, as I have found out with the War, Peace, and Justice Project. But that's all I have to say. They're both wonderful events, and I would like to attend both, which is not possible this year, and that's something that should be deconflicted in the future. But thank you for the time for listening.
Thank you. We'll get we had another hand up. Mm-hmm.
Good evening, Twanta Stallworth, Partridge Circle, Carlisle, PA. I just wanted to come. I was on Zoom, but I thought it was important to be in person to say a couple of words about the rescheduling of Amani. And it's personal for me for a couple of reasons. One of those is I was part of Amani. I was the vendor coordinator for a number of years. And so I recognize the work that goes into planning such an event and all of the hard work that goes into it. So folks over the years, even the original founding members, seeing them come to Amani, Dr. Rosario being one of those, and Stokes being another one of those. And I know the hour is late, so I'll try not to pontificate too long. But I do want to just give a word to some of the complications that this has presented for a number of people in our community, particularly the vendors. Today is July 5th, and we're asking folks and expecting them to come together, 40 local businesses, to hold their business together in plans for an event in 3 days. We just talked about how poverty is so entrenched in this community. And a lot of folks are depending upon festivals like these for their income to feed their families. And it would be a very, very, very misstep for us to not appreciate the impact that has on a number of folks. Full stop. I don't care where it is. It's on Fifth Street, Penn Street. It doesn't matter. That piece has to be recognized full on in conversation with the information that Councilor Mellon shared tonight. In addition to that, I know that there are a number of folks who have pledged their support of Amani, who are extremely included, who have wanted to spend their time to help and do things, and those requests have not been returned. And I think that's unfortunate and leads us to where we are tonight. This is what we are doing to move Amani to Fifth Street because of all of these things is a band-aid, right? And we're not looking at what is the real issue, what really led us to this place. And what led us to this place is communication that unfortunately just did not happen. There were things that needed to be communicated, and those things were not communicated with people that could either help them to be communicated, that could help them to expedite things or to facilitate processes, and this is where we are. And so I would encourage council, in the approval of this, to institute a contingency upon what a framework for next year's festival looks like. I think that that's a necessary piece, right? We can't just skip over this as though this was something unavoidable. This was a very preventable mishap. And unfortunately, the bearer of the brunt of this mishap are the vendors who will have to try to pull it together so that they can make good on the deposits I'm sure that they've already made that they will not get back, so that they can produce their wares and sell them, so that they can support their families. None of us should take that lightly tonight. Finally, I will say I do think it's a good idea if festivals such as Borough and Amani can come together. I think those forward-thinking measures are things that could have happened and would have been a great benefit to this community in light of racial reconciliation that we are attempting to accomplish. But we have to be diligent and intentional. Those things don't happen by happenstance. I would join Paul for Amani, but I'm leaving for the beach on Saturday.
Thank you. Yes, come on up to the podium, please. Did we lose the mic?
I think we did. I can just speak louder.
Do we have anybody by Zoom yet, Joyce? Do you know? Okay. All right.
So my name is Lisa Marie. I'm at 200 Forge Road. So I've come here, I'll be honest, frustrated with how things are going. Several years ago, I was on the board. I was the director of the Children's Alley and helped get Pet Path and Beyond going. To hear of the frustration from vendors, nonprofit, not getting a response was very sad to me. I was just beside myself because Amani means so much. Um, several people that had talked to me about it didn't know what it was, didn't know where it started, didn't know that it, started as Unity over at Dickinson, and the KKK had come, and it was to be there to show people that we were more than that, we were better than that, and we weren't going to stand for it. And it's evolved into so much, and to hear of all of the frustration going on was just, like I said, just very upsetting to me. And so I came in tonight. I didn't know who was going to be here, and saw Tanis and said, "Okay, I'm sign me up. I'm ready to be back on. I want to be on the board. I want this to go forward." I know that the dates. It's not an ideal situation. I've already said, listen, we need to go back. We need to recalculate. We need to look at what other dates we can use. And we have talked. This was not something that was new as far as looking at the dates because of the rain. We all knew that it was a gamble every year. So I definitely think that would be something. But I think with enough people from the community page on Facebook and the people that I've talked to, there's definitely a want to continue this. There's definitely the frustration of I wish I knew. I'm hoping everybody that has voiced their concern will be stepping up in the future. But I just don't want to see it go down the drain. I'd like to see it to continue. On the other hand, I'm also a nonprofit vendor at my full-time job. And so I was not available to be there on the first day, which turned out because I had another event. So I was like, yes, I can be here for that second one, only to find out that there was a possibility it may not happen. So I'm here to ask to employ this. I'm hoping that we can continue this. This is something that is so important to the community. It does bring in the business. Any event in the downtown that brings the community together is wonderful for the businesses to bring money in and for to feed their family. But it's also good in the sense that the more that we associate with our neighbors, whether it's hello, how are you, hi, a job opens up in a small business, and so and so has been rough on their luck, and oh, maybe I can offer them something. It joins us together more. It brings down the crime, anything like that, when we're more in tune with what our friends and family and neighbors are doing. And so that's any event downtown is very important where we can do that. I just guess my whole purpose is just to ask that we be able to continue, to give my promise that I will do the best that I can moving forward, and just I know that we feel that we definitely dropped the ball on some of those things, and I just see that there's a lot to be done to regroup. And I've even suggested maybe we need to start with having a public meeting, let people know so we can bring them in. You want to talk just as you are doing tonight for us, allowing us to come in and share what we have to say. That maybe we need to start with that, just letting our community know that we're going to come back stronger and what we can do, and invite other people in for some input. And the biggest thing right now is just we apologize that that this went the way it did, and to start off on a good foot and positive and move forward, and try not to let this coincide with any other event that is important to downtown, because as we know, vendors want to be at both, and it can be a difficult task. But I just think for moving forward for the future, that there's a lot of promise that we can do. We've done it before, we can do it again, and it was just a rough time. But as Tana said, what do we do when there's something that's a life-altering change in your, in every day, and there's not a backup? So there's definitely a learning curve that we need to take into consideration, go back to the drawing board. So I just hope that we can get the okay for that, and plan better and move forward. So thank you for your time. Did anybody have have anything before. So,
Thank you.
all right.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Any other? Sure. Come on up to the podium, please.
Hi, I'm Pastor Ed Roman. I'm with Carlisle Baptist Church, 701 Walnut Bottom Road. I know nothing about the communication and organizational issues. All right, that's not my purpose. But as a church that has become multi-ethnic over the last 8 or 9 years, I want to speak quite briefly for the support of Amani Festival, because you can fix a lot of things. And it's so hard to fix racial issues and cultural issues, especially if you're not communicating. So anytime we have that opportunity, once we stop doing it, it doesn't go back. So that's why it's important to us as a church that we see things like this, because having those open lines of communication is vital. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment on this item? Okay, I'm going to make a motion to remove this item from the table because it was tabled. I'm going to stick with Robert's rules. I'll make a motion to remove it from the table, and then I'll make the underlying motion. Hopefully somebody will second those for me. So I move that we remove the Amani Festival special event request from the table for consideration.
Second.
Second by Councilor Mellon. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Those opposed say nay. The motion passes. I move the council approve a special events application and street closure, as well as lifting of the sidewalk ordinance for the annual Amani Festival to be held on Saturday, July 8th, 2023, from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. The event is to take place on the first block of North Pitt Street. Approval shall be contingent upon the applicant receiving PennDOT approval, which has already been, well, we don't need that because we're off of High Street now, sorry. We will need receipt of a valid certificate of liability insurance form naming the Borough of Carlisle as an additional insured and reimbursing the Borough of Carlisle 100% of the variable costs and 10% of the fixed costs incurred by the borough. So it's, sorry, that was a little convoluted. So the motion as is on the page, restricted to North Pitt Street and without the need for PennDOT approvals. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Councilor Hicks. Any discussion on the motion?
I do just want to say something. I agree with Tawanda and Lisa. It is very important that communication is open. People need to know what's going on. This isn't the first year. Last year, there were a couple of organizations that reached out to me trying to find out who was in charge. They wanted to set up a table. They didn't hear anything back, so they decided, you know what, we haven't heard anything back, so we're just not going to participate. But they wanted to. It's an important event. People, and like I said, I saw the anger, I saw the comments, and people want to be there, but you need to communicate to people. And if that is, setting somebody aside, I understand what it's like to put an event together. Now, our events weren't as big as Amani, so I'm not trying to take that, but I understand what what it entails. Having a couple of people that are strictly in charge of communication, to answer emails whenever they come out, to answer phone calls, or answer the social media page is very, very important. This Amani Festival has been an important festival forever, and people don't want to see it gone. I'm going to be very honest. I was ready to say exit because of that, and because that it is now on the same day as bluegrass, and if that had been a where the two had come together and said let's do this together, okay, it would be different. So I just want to say that I'm not trying to beat you up about it or beat anybody up about it at all. I just want to say that you have to you have to hear people. You have to get back to people, and not 6 days, 2 weeks, 3 days. Like as soon as somebody reaches out, you have to get back to them because they do plan around that and they need to know as soon as possible because especially now during the summer, there are other things that are happening that they can go to, but they want to come to this. So, yeah, something needs to be put in place so that the communication is completely open. That's all.
One quick thing, not to put any sort of contingencies on this, as Tawanda mentioned, but and we don't need to go deep into it because it's in its infancy, but we are looking at our special events application process currently so that we can sort of connect these types of issues or questions and trying to really parse things out and have some more follow-up at the borough level to ensure that we can have those conversations in advance, not necessarily like micromanage or anything about vendors, but when it comes to like two things happening in the same place, not just, and especially some things are heightened with high street closures and those types of things. So some might, very small special event applications might not rise to that level, but I think we're looking at that internally in a bunch of different departments. So stay tuned for that. So it's not that once this action item is finished, there's still work to be done at the borough level, and we're committed to making sure that because I love both these events, and I will bounce between them, and it's also on us to make sure that we learn from everything too. So thank you.
Just that I'm going to be supporting this motion tonight because I think, as I said last meeting, the message and the goal is too important for this festival to not have it take place. But to the deputy mayor's point, and I again don't want to volunteer other people's time, and I'd be happy to do this, but I'm envisioning I think we need a working group with a staff member, a council member, and DCA because staff has spent, and thank you, a lot of time on this, but this wasn't the only one. We had Juneteenth and the showing of Carlisle, and it seems like as we have more great events, which we should, I'm almost envisioning a working group that in December says for the next year, to the best of our ability in 2024, here's the calendar. Put it on the borough website, and if you want to do something the weekend of Bluegrass next year, sorry, too late, right? We already have something going on. If you want to do something the weekend of Juneteenth, already booked. So working around those dates, I think, will help fix some of the communications issues and also hopefully help vendors to see, all right, this weekend I can be in Gettysburg, the next weekend I can be in Carlisle. I think it's a win-win. And I think, if DCA can be at the table with us, it won't fix everything and we won't be able to put everything on a calendar, but I'm thinking the more predictability or consistency we have, and then it also helps us market Carlisle. If people know, in February, Ice Arts Fest is going to happen, I'm going to schedule my visit. And then also, as somebody mentioned, Carlisle Events has a ton of events. So we can't close streets every weekend, but I think it's in fairness to the vendors and the residents of Carlisle to know, maybe if the streets are going to be closed, they can plan for that weekend if they're doing something else. So that would be my suggestion. Again, it doesn't have to be super formal, and I don't think we should micromanage the events, but I think some sort of collaboration where everyone is on the same page will hopefully fix some of these issues in the future.
Anything else?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like Councilor Perry and pretty much everyone else in this room, we all understand the importance of this event to the community. I have to say I wasn't sure I was going to vote yes to approve the event until this evening, which I will. But I am also from the nonprofit space. I've been in the nonprofit world for decade and a half in Carlisle, and I've run a lot of special events, and I know the importance of reputation and communication for the success of an event. And sometimes a very poorly organized event can actually be more harmful than just stepping back and saying, you know what, it's not going to work this year, we got to take some time off. I think, though, Pastor, I agree with you. Communication is important and we need to keep it open, but sometimes you do more damage by doing a thing poorly than by, admitting when you need to step back. So I'm happy to hear that we've sort of right-sized it, refocused the attempt, and now we're all on the same page about making sure that we're all committed to working together for this for next year to bring it back as the way it should be. So that's all I have to say.
Yep. I'm fully supportive of the festival going forward, and hopefully going forward in future years on the scale that it once was. As I remember, as a law school student, relatively new, and I mentioned this at our last meeting, relatively new to town. That it was wonderful to have Amani during finals week, to be able to walk out and there'd be some food out on the street, vendors and things to do to get your mind off of the last exam and the next exam coming up. So it's an opportunity for both the college and student population elsewhere to mingle with our residents in a very positive atmosphere that reflects the diversity of this borough. And on the general point of coordinating events, I mean that's been long needed. We've been discussing that a lot more recently, and I know from the feedback that DCA received on some of the events, even if they were coordinating, the consequences to businesses in town is sort of a mixed bag. Some saw big increases in revenue during those events, and some saw nothing when they'd normally be very, very busy. And a lot of that had to do with access to their parking, and just people generally trying to avoid where it's going to be crowded on a certain weekend. So as we go forward, we'll be thinking about that. I don't think there's anything further to discuss on this. Oh, go ahead.
I can't not say that, notwithstanding better coordination, I mean, I will work with these kind of problems every day. These are the kind of problems I want in the borough. This is indicative of the fact that we're a thriving community. We have interested residents, we have interested vendors, we have interested people who are engaging, and whatever efforts we need to make it, smoother, more transparent, I'm all for it. I just don't want this to close without recognizing these are the types of problems I'm happy to deal with every week. So appreciate everyone who's trying to advance our community. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. It's been a motion and a second. I'll call the question. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The motion passes and the application is approved. Everybody enjoy Saturday. Bluegrass and Amani. On the Public Works Committee.
The Cumberland County Small Bridge Inspection Program. I move that Borough agrees to participate in the Cumberland County Local Small Bridge Program by authorizing the mayor and manager to sign the county's enrollment form and submit the form to the county.
Been a motion by Councilor Perry for participation in the Cumberland County Local Small Bridge Program. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Councilor Stubbe. Any discussion? I'll call the question. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Motion passes.
And then the leaf collection ordinance, staff update.
All right, very quickly, now that we have the leaf vacuum, Borough Public Works expects to use it this fall. That will require a revision to your ordinance. Currently, your ordinance prohibits the raking of leaves and leaving the leaves as a curb. So for the meeting next week, there is a motion for you to authorize the advertisement of an ordinance that already has been drafted by the borough solicitor to make that necessary change. So that will be on the agenda for next Thursday's meeting.
Thank you.
Mark, quick question on that. So is the program slated to go into effect this fall?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Are you excited about that?
It's gonna say hours.
You can use those hours to volunteer for Amani.
I've been dying to ask since this is such a bespoke piece of equipment that's one of a kind. I'm just wondering if there's any consideration to giving it a name. I'll just leave it at that.
We actually said
an engaged contest.
We didn't have a naming contest, but there actually was a suggestion made by an individual that thought that, our heavy pieces of equipment, like our street sweeper and our leaf collection sweeper, should actually be wrapped and have a mural on it to portray what Carlisle is. So we're entertaining those at the staff level right now.
And we
What
have
that
we
could
have
look
some
like.
we have some feedback from strategic planning and the logo discussion
Mm-hmm.
that could inform some of that too. And the name, I like the name. That's good. Alley traffic comment.
Yeah, so I don't know if you want to just hold off on this subject until next workshop. It's not a time sensitive item, so I'll leave it up to you.
Yeah, does council want to proceed with this?
No objection. Mark's recommendation.
Everybody's ready to go. Thanks for giving us an out, Mark. We appreciate that. And by the way, there was I think a sort of compliment from Jared earlier about engineers. So I heard that.
I would not have used the ENR index, by the way.
Talked to the wrong one. Okay. Any further public comment tonight? We don't have anybody by Zoom at this point, Joyce. Okay. All right. They gave up on us. Then this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.